grateful to be able to come and speak to you all today. So thank you for this opportunity. As Phil said, I'm with the occupational therapy team. And I'm one of the workplace learning academics in this team. In this talk, I'm stepping a little bit away from the assessment feedback topic. And as Phil said, I'm talking about how we developed and implemented a workplace learning-based assessment item focusing on evidence-based practice. So just a bit of background. In occupational therapy, we have our major block placements in the first half of the year in fourth year, and then in the second half of the year in third year. Traditionally, what we did was the students submitted an assessment item 10 days after the conclusion of each of those placements. But as part of the reflection and planning process that we went through at the end of the year, we discovered a need to review those workplace learning related assessment items for a number of reasons. So with the previous assessment item, it was found that the students weren't having a lot of engagement with the university during their external placement. And completion of this assessment item was generally left till after the placement and not something that was meaningfully considered during the placement. And also having an assessment item submitted 10 days after the end of placement and then marked was having quite a significant impact on the timely finalization of grades. So we developed a new assessment item, which was the evidence-based practice and workplace learning assessment. The decision to change this assessment item was based on those factors that I've just talked about, but also related to a couple of subject changes that were also happening at the time. So, for example, HIP 202, which is evidence-based health practice and research, was revised, and it now takes the students quite explicitly through the steps of the evidence-based practice process. So that really, it's a subject that occurs in second year. So that really then fed in well to them doing the new assessment item during their placements. Another reason was that was considered. So there was quite important work being done in the school at the time. So the research team for this was Murphy, Ponnell, Patton, Freya, and Pope. And just very briefly on that, this research group was sponsored by ANZAPE, which is the Australian and New Zealand Association for Health Professional Educators, in 2019 to develop an evidence-based practice learning and assessment framework to address an identified lack of guidance for clinical placement supervisors. So their work was really inspired and guided by contemporary EBP scholarship. And the outcome of this work was the development of this EBP framework and a website. And the website also includes prompts for supervisors to use with students, as well as a poster which shows the 5 steps of the evidence-based practice process. So really helpful and practical resources were developed through that project group. So that's really the background to why we decided to develop this assessment item. So as part of the development of the evidence-based practice and workplace learning task, I got feedback and input from my occupational therapy team. So after I developed the rubrics and the task description, I got that feedback, as well as from an educational designer. And quite importantly, I also received practical assistance with the setup of the task and the rubrics on the Interact site through the journal tool from a learning resource officer. So that was really helpful practical assistance that I got there. So in that new assessment item, students need to apply the evidence-based practice process to a client or a client group that they have been working with during their placement. It includes 5 steps that students submit via the journal tool on the placement on their relevant subjects Interact site. And they do that at certain points throughout the duration of their placement. So I'll very, very briefly talk about the assessment. So in part 1, they give some background to the practice setting that they're working with and to the client, or if they're doing more of a project-based placement, to the client group. In part 2, they need to consider a health and well-being related scenario they have experienced during their placement to date, where the student or their supervisor needed some more information to assist with knowing what to do next with the client or the client group. They provide some details about the scenario and then provide the resulting evidence-based practice question. Then in part 3, they need to consider all the different sources of information they would consider in answering the evidence-based practice question. So that's the research evidence, but other sources of information too, such as the client's values and circumstances, the family member or the carer's opinions, the clinician's expertise, so that could be their supervisor or senior therapists in the service. Then they focus specifically on the research evidence and they discuss the database and the search strategy used. So that's the acquiring step. In the appraising step, they choose one of the articles that they would consider research evidence and they critically appraise it. And they're encouraged to use a formal critical appraisal tool like McMaster or JBI or CASP. And lastly, in part 5, they reflect on what they have learned from the information they gathered during the evidence-based practice process, including what they did and why, and what context, influencing factors, resources, constraints needed to be considered in deciding how they then actually went on to apply that information that they gathered during the evidence-based practice process. So that's a very brief summary. It was hoped that having those multiple smaller assessment items to complete throughout the duration of the placement would lead to more interaction or engagement with the university during their placements, which are obviously external. It was also hoped that this assessment item would encourage students to meaningfully consider evidence-based practice during their placements, and also have that opportunity to continue to work on academic literacies during a more practical subject. We also hoped that this would have a more positive impact on the timely finalization of grades.
So I'll give you a 5-minute alert.
5-minute warning, thank you.
Yep.
As an aside, most students also then get a break between placements or after their placements where they're not needing to submit assessment items, which is really helpful, I think. Here is a picture of how it's been set up on their i2Cite journal tool. So the students can go in and click and then submit their journal items. So they would submit a journal item at the end of sort of week 2, 3, 4, and 5 of their placement. Here is just how I would access the rubric. So I'd click on the blue link there and it would bring up the rubrics. And it looks something like that. So you could click on show description and then the information about the criteria would come up. Just to note that the Learning Resource Officer really helped me in the setup of this. So the students don't actually get a mark, they get satisfactory or unsatisfactory. And she really worked in the back end to help with that. So this assessment item was implemented in 2021, 60. In terms of issues and considerations, because of COVID, we've had lots of placement cancellation and postponements because of border closures and that sort of thing. So students have actually had really scattered placement dates, and also placement, it can be quite complex and stressful time for students. So we have found that students have asked for extensions to the various journal tools. So it's really been quite scattered. It made it very difficult to mark a whole lot of, journal 1 or journal 2 at a time, moderate it, and return it because of the students being on very different placement journeys. And this had an impact on our marking efficiencies. We also needed to make sure that we marked each journal item in a very timely manner. So within the week that it was submitted, because so that they could get feedback and then implement the changes into the next parts of the journal. It was really especially important in part 2 in getting the evidence-based practice question right, as this had a significant flow-on effect then to the, the acquiring step, the appraising step. So we needed to have that really quick turnaround, which is not always possible.
1 minute warning there, Kim.
Okay. And I suppose one more thing is I found that it's, I don't know if it was user error or not, but I found that it is not as easy to provide detailed feedback via the journal tool. For example, one can't use comments or track changes to comment on specific, errors with written expression. And I found that because it was submitted on the journal tool and not via EAST, there seemed to be a bit lower engagement in good use of APA. So just quickly, in future, this cohort of third-year students is going to do this assessment in 4th year. This will provide further opportunity for practice and consolidation and really getting that chance to apply what they've read to their client and situation. The requirements of this assessment item for 4th year will be reviewed, and there'll be more expectation in the areas of academic writing and referencing, critique of literature, and application of literature to the student's client and situation. And use of a formal critical appraisal tool will be compulsory. And we will also have a look at the SES. With workplace learning subjects, we only get the results of that in April or May the following year. So it's a bit late, released a little bit later.
Okay,
Thank you.
Have to wrap it up there, Kim. And unfortunately, I'd have a stack of questions about this, but we'll have to complete our session here. So I'd just like to say a big thanks to our 4 presenters. And most of you have been here during all 4 sessions, so you can give them a little clap or whatever it is that on the on the reactions there. So Hector, Raquel, Paul, and Kim, thanks very much for your information on assessment and feedback. It's been super useful. I'll wrap things up here. Please enjoy the rest of CS EdX. Thanks very much for taking the time to join us today. Bye for now.